Welcome to Future Week Day 4 and to this exciting presentation we are about to get here in the restaurant. I see we have a few fans here from last time, and last time was 2 years ago during Future Week 2021, where the speaker presented several really both entertaining and interesting presentations on esoteric topics. Is that okay to say?
It's perfectly fine.
Thank you. So, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome to the Future Week stage, on behalf of Media City Bergen and the Norwegian Media Cluster, Mr. Anders Norås, and give him a big hand of applause, everybody!
So this thing you're hearing right now is the Iliac Suite for string quartet. And this is the first ever piece of music to be composed by a computer. And it was composed by this computer right here, which probably doesn't look like a computer to most of you. And that's because this is a mechanical computer. And Lerjan Hiller spent 5 years in the early 1950s programming this thing to compose the piece of music you just heard a small piece of. There are sort of 4 different parts to that composition, and it's quite long. It gets quite extreme over time, and it's really, really difficult to play. So this thing was programmed by something called Monte Carlo simulations, which today we would probably call AI, but back then it was only maths and statistics. So, welcome to this talk called High Scores, a brief history of computer music. So, last time I was here at Media City, I did a talk on the history of computer-generated art. And one of the questions that came up every time I did that talk was, what about music? So today I'm here to answer that question, what about music? And today we're going to go through the history of music played by computers. And it's going to be a ride that takes you around the world and with quite a bit of nostalgia in there. So welcome along. So this right here is the CSIR computer. And this is a computer that was in Australia just after the Second World War. This was one out of 5 programmable computers around in the world at the time. And this also looks quite different from the computers we have today. One of the things with this is that it didn't really have the user interfaces that we're used to. It didn't have a screen or anything like that. But it did have a small loudspeaker connected to it so that the computer could make a little beep noise whenever something had finished, so that the engineers operating this thing knew when their programs had finished running. So one of the engineers working with this thing came up with the ingenious idea of modulating the pitch of that computer, or that little speaker connected to this computer, and it sounded like this. So this is Colonel Bogie's March, and it also has some lyrics to it, post-war lyrics, you could look that up. So it's marching band music that was really popular at the turn of the century, all over the world actually, not only in Germany, where marching band music still is popular. So those little beepy noises were the first ever sounds played by a computer, or music at least. And it's really good to have a story that doesn't start in America for once, but we can't get around getting over to America as well. Because at Bell Laboratories in the United States, the engineers there were naturally working with different kinds of sounds since they were a telephone company. And Max Matthews, who was one of the engineers there, started working on a little pet project to make music with computers. And he created a programming language called Music 1, which was really the first ever specialized programming language to create music. And for us in the IT industry, we always come back to talking about specialized languages. We always come back to using music as an example, because we already have a renowned language for describing music, which is sheet music. So whoever can read sheet music can play that sort of music. So this was a digital take on actually creating something like that. And he created a piece of music in 1957 called Silver Scales, and it sounded like this. So a nice bit of music concrete, I guess we would call this. And it's really just random beeps and noises playing throughout, but it has some heft to it. But this takes us to
Putney, where Peter Zinoviev has a hobby which is strictly for boffins. He keeps it in his garden shed, and it's called Digital PDP 8/S. Yes, it's a computer, and it has a hobby too, composing music. Peter helps with the ideas, but the actual performance is all Digital's work.
So, Peter Zinoviev, working out of his garden shed in Putney in England, had quite a bit of kit set up there, and he started experimenting with this digital PDP/8 computer. It's a 12-bit computer, and he did, around the same time as Max Matthews was working at Bell Laboratories, he started making his own programming language as well, called Muses. And it looks like this. This doesn't really look like the way we're used to read music, but it has some information there. It's going to play note number 56, and it's going to be at volume 12, and so forth. And then he added more to this to create sort of randomness into how the computer played this music. And then he took this with him to the Royal Elizabeth Hall.
The next item, Partita for Unattended Computer by Peter Zinoviev, is a true live performance in the sense that no magnetic tape is being used at all. Furthermore, the computer has a choice at various stages in the procedure, and the piece therefore comes out different every time it's played. The performance you're about to hear is therefore unique and unrepeatable. First of all, checks are made to see that the composition is correctly loaded into the computer. The computer is started and will carry out the performance unattended.
It's a nice bit of proto-techno music we got playing here, and this is from the first ever concert for electronic composers at the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London. This was recorded in 1967, and this was a sellout event. Rumor has it that the queues went around the building, and there were no performers involved in this. This was just Peter Zinoviev's computer on stage, and as you saw this, set it off, and then it played by itself. And he had programmed some rules about how the music should be performed, but it was the computer making all the decisions all along the way. So the press wasn't really impressed by this. The Times wrote, "Technically, it may be a triumph of skill and knowledge, but what we heard resembled the dreariest kind of neo-Webern drawn out to inordinate length." And for the less cultured among you, the term neo-Webern refers to the Austrian composer Anton von Webern, who was known for making atonal music. But this was the mainstream media. In the scientific press, such as Wireless World and Computer Weekly, this got rave reviews, and they wrote page up and page down about this performance. And this, I believe, is the first time ever that a computer has given a concert. Let's go back to Bell Laboratories. This computer here in the background is the IBM 704. And back in 1961, the programmers working at IBM and Bell Laboratories were trying to make the computer able to speak. And again, this was Bell Laboratories, telephone company. Having a computer that could talk in the telephone would be a good thing. So Max Matthews, again, started experimenting with this. And John Kelly, which you see on the left-hand side here, and Carol Lackbaum here, Carol sat down and programmed vowel for vowel in a song. And the song was Daisy Bell.
Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer too.
It's a quite nice song, isn't it? And actually, if any of you are on TikTok, this song has quite recently been sort of a TikTok hit in another version than this one. But A Bicycle Built for Two, Daisy Bell, is a TikTok song. If you're not on TikTok, you might know this from somewhere else, because this was something that didn't go unnoticed in the 1960s. And if any of you think that this is something that I've heard before, it might be this.
Yes, I'd like to hear it, Hal. Sing it for me.
It's called Daisy. 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 Give me
So one of the most iconic death scenes in all of film history has Hal singing A Bicycle Built for Two as the power drains away, the last little electrons run through his system before he is shut down. And I think this is a really good homage at the end of the 1960s to the work that the people at Bell Laboratories started at the beginning of the 1960s, making computers able to sing. So with 2001, A Space Odyssey from the 1969, we go over to the 1970s. And the era of computer games. So this is the classic game, Space Invaders. And you might not think of Space Invaders as having music, but it has a little 4-note loop, that bass loop that is down there. And this is a game that uses that simple little piece of music to entice a feeling in the player. Because as the spaceships approach, the loop goes faster and faster and faster, inducing that feeling of stress, that the end is near, and that you get a bit stressed out trying to fight off those aliens approaching, and in the end you are going to fail. You have to fork out another quarter and put it into the machine and keep it going. And that is sort of a device that the makers of Space Invaders borrowed from a film that came out 2 years earlier. Because if you've seen Steven Spielberg's Jaws, it's the exact same thing that is on the theme there. You have the music, dun 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 dun. Space Invaders is the same thing. Just a year later, music on arcade machines had gotten way longer. This is the classic game Rally X. And Caruso, who wrote the music for this, had to write it down on paper in hexadecimal code to then be programmed into the computer inside this thing. But it sounds quite good, and we hear that distinctive sound that we associate with computer music, that little funky buzzy sound down there. And this thing was the first ever piece of computer game music to be released on a vinyl record. This was released on an album called Video Game Music on Yen Records in Japan in 1984. Now, every single computer game that comes out has a soundtrack to go with it, but this was the first one. But we want to take music into our homes as well, not only on vinyl records, but played by computers. And this is the Atari 2600. One of the first mainstream sort of game consoles that you could buy. And this game is aptly called the Music Machine. It's a very rare game. This was only sold in Christian bookshops. And that this little machine was able to play music at all is a wonder. Because it had a 5-bit pitch. That means that it was able to play 32 different tones, and tones, not notes. It didn't relate to the Western scale at all. In addition, it was also influenced by the fluctuations in the power coming into this, so everything sounded quite off. So it was obvious that people deserved something better.
I'm more alive than ever before. I've been to my Commodore 64. My friends are knocking down my door to get into my Commodore 64.
It's mind-boggling. Commodore 64 lets you play hundreds more games than any video machine, plus draw, program, even do music.
I'm more alive than ever before, and my friends are knocking down my door. 'Cause now we're into so much more. We're into our Commodore 64.
The classic Commodore 64, which has this thing inside it. This is the MOST Technologies 6581 sound processor. And this was designed by an engineer at Commodore called Robert Jans. And he said that the sound chips on the market, even the ones made by Atari, have been designed by people who know nothing about music. And he set out to create something way better. And he ended up designing this. And this is pure legend. This one is something that you will meet in many different occasions later. And this is probably where many of you guys also had your first meeting with computer music. And it sounded like this. This is the game Mule, which was one of the first games that were released for the Commodore 64 in 1984. Music by Daniel Bunton. And this sort of sounds quite plain. You can see on the oscilloscopes that they are sort of quite basic waveforms. But just 2 years later, things sounded like this. This is the classic soundtrack by Rob Hubbard called to the game Commando. And as you can see, things are way busier. Things are bouncing around all the way. And this is because the musicians had learned how to really use this sound processor that was in the Commodore 64 to its full extent. And they were using all sorts of tricks to get that funky, deep bass sound in there. And this is also the thing that you found later on the Game Boy and the game Tetris, which is a big classic. This actually inspired a musician to go out and get a top 10 hit in the UK with a dance music cover of the Tetris game under an alias, but the real name of that person was Andrew Lloyd Webber, happening a decade later than this. So this was where it all started. 1985, the Commando soundtrack by Rob Hubbard. So why on earth does the Mario theme from the same year sound as dull as this? Nothing wrong with Koji Kondo's composing, but it's a bit boring, it's a bit flat. And the reason is this. The Nintendo was designed to have some preset sounds that you could use. There was 2 square waves, a triangle wave, and a noise channel. There was also a PCM sample channel that could be used, but the Nintendo didn't have enough memory to actually use that for anything. And this is also why all of the original Nintendo game soundtracks sound mostly the same, because you had very little at your disposal when creating music for the original Nintendo. So let's get back to the SID processor that you found in the Commodore 64. Because this is the SID station. And the Swedish synth manufacturer Electron bought up the entire surplus stock of SID music processors in the late 90s and created this little synthesizer module, which has the original Commodore 64 SID processors inside it. And you've all heard this, because if you've heard music by the Swedish artist Robin, Daft Punk, or the local Bergen band Röyksopp, they've all used this little thing. And why not? Why not do the Röyksopp thing? This is the flip side to the very first Röyksopp 7-inch single. And those guys know where they're coming from. This is called the 64 position, and it has that classic Commodore 64 soundtrack to it. So let's just enjoy a bit of Bergen history. Sounds right, doesn't it? And I know that the guys are doing this in their concerts as well, so the 64 position by Rakes Up, played on the Commodore 64. And they probably use something like this to create this. And this guy here is 17-year-old Chris Hillsbeck, working on his Commodore 64. In 1985, the same year as Rob Hubbard did that soundtrack. This is a song Chris Hillsbeck composed. It's called Shades. That's that distinctive sound. Sounds perfect. But what he did was that he created this program called the Sound Monitor, which was a tool to compose music for the Commodore 64 on the computer's terms. So this doesn't look like your regular music program where you would expect to see notes and everything. This is a programming language that enables you to configure the sounds and the processor, which enables you to actually get those funky little sounds and those arpeggios and all those things that make classic computer soundtracks sound as they do. So another German, this is Jochen Hippel. He had another computer. This is the Atari ST. Me, myself, also went out and bought an Atari ST, expecting it to have brilliant sounds. It was marketed to having a Yamaha sound processor. A little did I know that that was just a generic, off-the-shelf, kind of basic sound processor that was just marketed or built on license by Yamaha, so it had nothing to do with the other Yamaha things. But hey, Yamaha is my favorite motorcycle and synthesizer producer, so I had one of these. So Jochen Hippel did this thing where he picked up on what Chris Hillsbeck had done and really squeezed the most out of this sound processor, getting that same little funky sound, but if you listen closely, it doesn't have the depth. It doesn't have that analog feel that the Commodore 64 has, so it doesn't give you that nice little booming bass down there. So someone were more lucky to have the Amiga computer instead. And the Amiga had a brilliant sound processor. Now, you might all have heard the story about how Steve Jobs allowed his engineer to sign the inside of the original Macintosh computer. So if you take that apart, you'll find the signatures of all the engineers working on the team there. Jay Miner at Commodore went one step further. He allowed his engineers to Christian the components they worked on after the second others. So this is the Paula music processor with the name of the guy who designed its girlfriend. And what you're hearing is a song by Danish composer Jesper Kyd called Global Trash. And this has a great sound. The software he was working with was something called a sound tracker. And the sound tracker software, first made by Carson Oblowski, and then in numerous other reincarnations by other people, was something that should change the way music was composed, because this really made it much easier to make great music on the computer's term and to get that kind of sound out of it. So we'll stick with the Amiga a bit further with a classic game that pushed things to the limit. This is the game Turrican 2. And if you listen closely, the sound here is way richer than what we just heard. And this is really where the teenage engineering skills of Jochen Hippel and Chris Hillsbeck meet. Because Chris Hillsbeck did the soundtrack for this using the tricks and techniques that Jochen Hippel had devised when he created music for the Atari ST to add 3 channels to the sound of the Amiga. So the Amiga originally had 4 channels that you could use for music. This game has 7. Let's get back to Bergen. These are some records from my own collection. They are all made by a sort of the originator of the Norwegian disco scene, a composer from Bergen called Erot. But I'm going to let someone else tell his story because they tell it way better than me.
You would be correct to call those records seminal that he made because listen to them.
People should be aware of the equipment he used to make those records. People would laugh now. Your phone is more powerful.
The stuff he did freed a lot of producers from what they believed was right and wrong. Producers like him is really necessary for music to grow.
Sounds so good. And Tore made all of this music in his bedroom using Sound Tracker software. So he showed the world that you could go out and use these things devised in the 1980s by people like Chris Hilsbeck, Jochen Hippel, and others to create booming dance soundtracks that would sound great on the dance floor. And other people did as well. This is Calvin Harris from his debut album from, I guess it's 2007. It's an homage to the 1980s, acceptable in the 80s. And Calvin Harris today is a big name on the electronic dance music scene, but back then he didn't really have much equipment to produce anything. So he too did as Tore and created all of his music on a Amiga 1200 computer. So his debut album, which was a breakaway success, composed on a Commodore Amiga way back in 2007, and that was acceptable in the 80s.
Planet Earth, a scientist creates the ultimate machine. At last! A machine that will give him the power to journey into the mega world. With thousands of colors, 16-bit graphic technology, and 10-channel mega stereo sound. The most advanced video game system in the universe. Yes! Mega Drive from Sega.
Because as we come in to the 90s and people were expecting better things to make music with. And again, this is a proper Yamaha thing. Because this is the thing that was inside the Sega Mega Drive. And this one you've all heard. Because this is the same music processor that was in Magne Furuholmen's synthesizer, which is the one played on the breakaway hit Take On Me. So suddenly, computer music programmers had the same tools at their disposal as a-ha had when they created the biggest hit ever. And boy, did they use that. So this is the classic game Street Fighter II, music by Yoko Shihimura. And she did something very special for this. Because in the fighting game, you really don't have any tools to get some backstories to the characters. But she used music in a genius way to sort of tell the stories and add more depth to the characters in this game. And this was remastered and sold on a vinyl album that was released in 2015. And it sold out in 5 minutes when it was dropped on Bandcamp. So this one is a real relic to get hold of. But Street Fighter, Norås, Street Fighter has become a big phenomenon within the hip-hop world. And we just heard one example of this. This is another thing. This is Kamasi Washington Jr., a really, really good jazz musician who was really fond at playing Street Fighter when he was younger. And from his previous album, he did this, created his own Street Fighter theme for himself. And the music video to go along with it. And there are so many hip-hop artists that have made music based on Street Fighter, sampled songs and sound effects from Street Fighter, and so forth, so that Street Fighter rap is actually now a subgenre within the hip-hop community. But there is one person in particular who is really special there, and that is the rapper Lupe Fiasco. Because Lupe Fiasco is probably one of the hip-hop world's most dedicated Street Fighter players. So much that when Street Fighter was released in the new version, he went up against the world champion esports player of Street Fighter, Daigo Umera, in a showcase match. And guess what? Lupe Fiasco went on to win that thing and officially becoming the world street fighting champion. Whew. When a computer game starts like that, you should have high expectations. And that was what the makers of the classic game Wing Commander had as well. Chris Roberts, who created this and also composed the music for the game, wanted to create a game that was a space opera akin to Star Wars. And you can hear that in the musical soundtrack here, that this is very, very Star Wars inspired. But what was special with this is that he created a sound and music engine for his game that could adapt the music to the gameplay. So when he engages into battle now, you hear that the music changes, it gets more intense, and it does this seamlessly. And what Chris Roberts did there is that he set the trend for what was to come. But one game that did this perfectly is the classic adventure game Monkey Island 2. Now, Michael Land, who did the music for the original Monkey Island game, was sort of frustrated about the limitations that he felt when he was composing for the first Street Fighter game. So he went on to create something called the Interactive Music Streaming Engine, or iMuse, which is used for the first time in Monkey Island 2. And what that does is that it enables him to sort of direct the music much in the same way that a pitmaster would direct an orchestra. So as Guybrush Threepwood walks around on Scab Island, the music changes with the scenes and the people he interacts with. And this happens seamlessly in the background. So suddenly he had that pit orchestra to direct. And this was the golden age of computer music. Things should get much bleaker. This is one of the original advertisements for the Sony PlayStation. And the PlayStation was marketed towards adults. It was marketed in nightclubs around. It was the advertisement we just saw was sort of divided into little LSD tabs that so it was obviously for a different audience. And they had, like in Wipeout, music from the top electronic artists at the time. Great music by the Prodigy here, but it doesn't really relate to the game at all. it's just a background soundtrack. And that's because the Sony PlayStation had CDs, and it could play the music straight off the CD. That did a few things for some of the artists that games featured music from. For example, the British rock band Ash had a second album that was a total flop, but it still made loads of money because they had licensed their music to one of the Sony PlayStation games. So it was obvious that that kind of advanced technology was not something that the world was ready for. We need something simpler. And this was another console that was around at the same time, the Nintendo 64, the classic game GoldenEye 64. But Nintendo always made things with the cheapest technology around. So the Nintendo 64 didn't even have a dedicated sound processor like the others had. Everything had to be done by the main processor. It had a theoretical possibility to do up to 100 channels at the same time in sort of near CD quality, but the games didn't have nearly enough memory to do that. So the composers making music for that had to go back to the techniques from the 80s that Chris Hülsbeck, Jochen Hippel, and the others we met earlier had come up with to sort of be able to piece together the music in a good way and get this booming soundtrack that really evokes the classic James Bond feeling. And this sounds like John Barry who meets Faith No More's We Care a Lot, and I guess that's good. So, the Nintendo 64, curious thing, because Koji Kondo, who did all of the Mario music, he is a genius when it comes to composing. And there is this hidden level in Mario 64, which is called the Endless Staircase. This one. It goes on forever and ever. You can find videos of this on YouTube, where you can watch this for 48 hours in a stretch. But there's a curious thing going on here. Listen to the music. Because this is algorithmically created music. And if you listen, it just keeps on going up, up, and up, and up, and up in pitch. Funny thing this. And this is a musical illusion, something called the Shepherd scale, where two octaves are moving in parallel and then just looping around. And it fools your brain into thinking that it always goes up, up, and up, and up, and up. So music created by algorithms was not something that was new then. This is the classic Brian Eno album, Music for Airports, from, I guess, 1978, I believe, which was the album that created the phenomenon known as ambient music. And this thing on the left-hand side here is an app called Bloom, also created by Brian Eno. This was one of the first applications to be released for the iPhone after Apple opened up their App Store to developers. And it has this really nice interface where you just touch the screen and it creates music. So it creates these lush ambient soundtracks, all created by algorithms that live inside your phone. And this is the thing that Brian Eno also did when he composed for computer games. This is the game Spore. And again, you have that endless soundscape that reacts to what happens in the game. It was done by Brian Eno using a visual programming language where he could sit around, play with things, connect things together, and then just let the programmers of the game just change variables here to change what happens in the game. But one thing about this, it tends to be a bit boring. It's like spa music. It doesn't have that edge. And that was something that was going to change in the game No Man's Sky a bit later. Because No Man's Sky is a huge universe with 18 quintillion different planets that you can fly around and visit. It is endless. And to match that, it also needs to have that same endless soundtrack. And the soundtrack for this was composed by the math rock band 65 Days of Static. you can see them up to the right here. And being a math rock band, they know a bit about algorithms and how computers work. And they created a soundtrack which they recorded to be recomposed by the computer as the game evolved. So you can hear that you have this sort of prog rocky thing that goes on, and it changes around. And the band themselves more or less described this as being jazz music composed by computers when they created this. So this is a classic thing, and it has that depth and the edge that makes the music way more interesting. So No Man's Sky weren't the first sort of proper musicians to compose for video games. This is the game Quake. Has a soundtrack by 9 Inch Nails. And the soundtrack with the industrial rock sound of 9 Inch Nails has that gritty feel that goes well with the sort of apocalyptic worlds of Quake, and it really sounds real good. Other people, it's like David Bowie did computer game music. This is the game Omnicron, and it features a song by David Bowie.
You're cold and hard gone. I really can't look at you.
So the late great David Bowie with a song that is only available within this game, and it's hidden deep within the game. It's never been released on any of his albums. So David Bowie has this little gem hidden deep within this 90s style VR game called Omnicron. You should play it sometime. This is obviously Michael Jackson. And it's a game for the Sega Mega Drive. It's called Moonwalker. It's all based on Michael Jackson's music. I think in hindsight, the plot of the game, having Michael Jackson walking around the mansion, picking up children, wasn't the best of ideas. But it features his song, Smooth Criminal, played in 10-channel mega stereo sound by that Yamaha sound processor that is found within the Sega Mega Drive. And rumors have been around that Michael Jackson was quite involved with Sega and that he had composed music for Sonic the Hedgehog. This is the game Sonic 3, Sonic and Knuckles. And what you're hearing in the background is Michael Jackson's song Stranger in Moscow and the end credit theme from Sonic and Knuckles played on top of each other. And they fit perfectly together. So this was written by Michael Jackson. The song Stranger in Moscow was released 2 years later. It's very unlikely that he copied his music from a Sonic the Hedgehog game. The only person who has ever done that is the Swedish musician Håkan Hellström on his song Känn ingen sorg för mig i Göteborg, which is a Sonic the Hedgehog song. But this was Michael Jackson composing for Sega. He just didn't want that to be known because he didn't really like the way his music sounded, even in 10-channel mega stereo sound. So, a personal favorite of mine before we leave the 1990s, and this is the game Xenon 2 Mega Blast. It features a soundtrack by hip-hop artists Bomb the Bass, and David Whittaker has done a really faithful recreation of their song. And this sort of closes the loop on sample-based music, which was what the Soundtracker software was really about, because that was also what Bomb the Bass were doing. And this, I guess this sounds kind of good. So let's go to the movies. So in 2019, one of the big album releases that summer was a video game soundtrack. It was a video game soundtrack for the game Red Dead Redemption 2. Here with Ryan Giddens' song Mountain Hymn, which was featured in the game. And the makers of Red Dead Redemption did something very special with the first game that they continued building upon in the second one. They recorded hours upon hours of different pieces of music, all in the same tempo, all in the very forgiving key of A minor, so that the game itself could remix and recompose that music to fit the gameplay and still have that believable Western soundtrack to go with it. And these games are long. They have hours upon hours of gameplay, and you never grow tired of the music. So Red Dead Redemption did a very special thing that when they created the first game. They could have, of course, done this. Some more Western music. But this is all composed by a computer. This is done by OpenAI's MuseNet. And OpenAI's MuseNet is an artificial intelligence that is trained to make country music. It is also trained to make 60s style Beatles-like pop music. And it can compose and play this all on its own. And this sounds like something that you could play in a saloon, doesn't it? This is something different. This is the band Skygge, which is a French band, despite the name. They make music inspired by French 80s pop. And it's all created by a company called Flow Machines. So, as you probably guessed, this music is composed by an AI. And I think also that the lyrics is written by an AI.
After feed, more little bit. After feed,
Or it might just be written by a Frenchman who doesn't know a word of English. But this sounds like me 4 years old thinking that I was speaking English. But this sounds good. And it's played by humans. But it's all composed by this computer. And there are similar projects going on. There's something called JukeTech, which also does this. Google has something called the Magenta Project, which composes music. And why are these people doing this? The reason is that there is loads of money in music writing credits. With the streaming thing, you have to have the writing credits to the song to make any money. And if you look back to the Travis Scott and Drake monster hit from a few years back called Sicko Mode, that has 30 people on the credits list for the writing credits. So people want to get that money. And if you have a computer that makes believable music and writes believable lyrics, you can get that money. So, Magic Man by Skygge. Nice bit of folk music, that. And this is something created by a researcher called Alden Bental. It's called FolkRRN. It's a neural network that writes folk songs. And that sort of makes sense. This sounds like really, really believable folk music. But if you think about it, the tradition of folk music has always been that you hear someone else play something, you try to play the same thing, you make your own take on it, you sort of develop the sound, and then someone else hears you play, and they do their take on it. That's the entire folk tradition, how folk music is made. And that's also how an artificial intelligence learns. It learns by studying what others have done before it. So writing folk songs with AIs works remarkably well, But this was played by a proper folk orchestra, though. It wasn't played by a computer.
Machines are making most of the music now. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed that all the songs sound the same? I mean, I don't know if you've noticed that. I mean, I mean, you could be hearing one song. I mean, you could take the lyrics from another song and put it right onto because the rhythms are the same. You know, the drum and the drones are the same, and the machines can only do so much. You know, they can only make it sound different so many different kinds of ways. So it doesn't sound different. It sounds all the same. And that's good for the industry because a lot of people invent these machines and need, you know, and sell these machines. Plus, it's also very good is you could have your own little band, like a one-man band with these machines. You know what I mean?
You can have your own little band. So this is Bob Dylan talking about computers making music way back in 1987. It could have been said today. It's obvious that machines are going to be making more music in the years to come. But as someone who loves music and loves to play music myself, I still hope that people will have some role in it, because that's when things sound really, really good. This has been High Scores, a brief history of computer music. Thank you all for coming. We have been through loads of things, so if there are any songs that you would like to revisit, you have the list here. Thank you all.
Thank you.